Hello and welcome to another Developer Essentials. So this time around, we're going to be taking a look at scenes in a lot more detail and how we can work with that, in particular, how we can work with a scenario where we've got multiple scenes and transitioning between them and different little bits and pieces like of that. So to begin with, we're going to need a few different scenes. So I'm actually just going to rename this one to, this is going to become our main menu. And then I'm going to create a couple of other scenes. So initially what we'll take a look at is just the process of being able to switch between different scenes. So going from our main menu into a different scene and then back. And then we're going to take a look at some more sophisticated things that we can do in terms of looking at stuff like being able to have multiple scenes loaded at the same time and why we might want to do that. And also looking at things like being able to have a loading screen to transition between scenes. So let's just get set up. I'm going to call this level 1, and then let's also have level 2. So in my main menu, what I want to be able to have is I just want to have a little bit of UI. But what it's going to do is, I'm just going to use standard buttons for this. So load level 1. So I just want to be able to select to either load level 1 or level 2. And let's set this up nicely with a panel. And just to nicely contain the different sort of buttons there, we'll go for our usual design size for this. That's good. Bring our buttons into here. Now that panel, I am going to center it, and I'm going to make it, say, 400 wide and 600 high. That's pretty good. And then I want to have my usual of a vertical layout group. We will force expand in width, but not in height. And if we align it to the middle center, that'll appear nicely there. Up some padding. That looks pretty good. I'm going to make these two larger as well, though, just so that they're a bit of a clearer size, seeing as it is a main menu. That's pretty good. So this will be level 1. This will be level 2. And the other thing that I will do is I'm going to change it so my color, my background, the camera, it's just a fixed solid color for the main menu. There's lots of things that you can do with your main menus there in terms of how you want that to look. Sometimes you might grab like a segment of your level and have that in there, maybe with a camera slowly panning around it. That was something that really stood out in Half-Life 2's menus, where it would have stuff like that in different little scenes. So you could be doing something like that if you wanted. But we've got our setup here for the different levels, so that's good. So we just want to be able to tell that we're in the other scenes. So what I'm going to do is level 1 is going to have a cube in that scene. And level 2 is going to have a sphere. So I want to have that. That's good. And in each of those levels, I probably want a way to get back. So that would be handy to have a bit of UI that is going to return me back to the main menu. So again, this time I won't put this in a panel. I will still do the usual setup that I do for the sizing. 20, 80. So this in-game HUD. Maybe just in-game UI. So it's going to have main menu. I'm going to align that to the bottom left. Position that. More like there, that's better. Increase the size of this a bit too. And we also then want to bring down the position there. That looks pretty good. This larger. Excellent. So then what I will do is I'm going to set up a couple of scripts. So one of the ones I'm going to set up is a script just for managing that in-game HUD. So create the C# script, in-game UI. Because what I want to do is because this is going to be in multiple levels, I want to make it nice and easy for being able to set this up. So I'm just going to set up the function that I'll hook into for now. I won't actually set up the code logic yet. Go to main menu. So just want to have this, because the thing I want to do is I would have this in-game UI in each of my levels. So I don't want to have to set this up every single time in each one. I just want to be able to set it up once. So I'm going to link this up, in-game UI, and on go to main menu. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a prefab. So prefabs are useful not just for things like various assets that might be in the scene, like various fixtures of a level that we're using multiple times. We can use them for, this is another perfect case of stuff like our in-game UI, where we're going to have that in multiple different scenes, and we just want to easily be able to have that in all of them, but then update that if we need to. So there we go. Both of them have got that set up now, which is good. So then I can go to my main menu and we can start to look at setting it up. So it's going to need a main menu script, because we need to handle clicking on the different buttons here. So we're going to put that on the canvas, which I'm going to rename that. And then let's set this up. So similarly, this is going to have going on load level 1. It's also going to have on load level 2. And just for completeness, I'm also going to put in an on exit. So it's something we haven't looked at so far, but I think that's a useful thing to look at as well, of what do we actually do for an exit button. So this can be exit game, and we'll see what we actually have to do setup-wise for that. So okay, let's link up these. So we're ready to set up the code, because the code's going to be very similar for all of these. It's going to be very, very similar for each one of these. And initially, we are just going to set it up so it loads straight into those levels. We're not going to worry about anything like a loading screen, any transitions, anything like of that. We're focused just on having it load those other levels. And then we'll have a look at some of the more sophisticated things that we can do. So okay, we've got that set up, be running those blocks of code. Well, let's start with exit. This one's a pretty easy one. You can do application, quit, done. That will cause your application to quit. An important thing to remember with that, though, is when we're playing in the editor, it will actually not do anything. You might be expecting it to stop it from playing. It won't actually do that. When we're in the editor, it does nothing. It doesn't mean that it's broken. It just means that in the editor, it's actually being prevented from performing any actions. When we have an actual build of the program, this will cause it to immediately exit. But let's take a look at the loading side of things. So to work with this, what I'm needing is I need to bring in the scene management system. So with scene management, I can say, hey, scene manager, and I can tell it to load a scene. And we've got two different versions here. We've got load scene and load scene async. So async there is short for asynchronous. So what that's meaning is load scene, this first one, when we run that, say we've got a really large level, so a level that takes a bunch of time to load. When we use load scene, the game will effectively stop, pause while that loading is happening. So what we usually refer to that as is it's blocked. So it's a blocking call. So nothing else can happen in the background while that is loading. And that's less so ideal. We often want to be able to have things happening there in the background. For example, we might want to put up a loading screen. We might want to show the progress with the loading. Or if we're trying to have a fairly large environment and we're wanting really seamless transitions, we might want to kick off a bit of loading happening in the background, and then we just finalize it when the player gets nearby so that it's essentially seamless to them. So that's where we would use async. For now, to start off with, we're just going to use load scene. We're dealing with very small, very simple scenes, so it's not going to cause a huge issue there, but just something to be aware of with it. Now, when I go and do this, we can see there's lots and lots of different versions of it. There's versions that take a string, and that's the name of the scene, and there's versions that take an index. And we'll take a look at what those actually refer to in a moment. But if I set this to level 1, we'll also see this load scene mode, and we have a choice of either single or additive. So load scene single, what that does is, so we're in the main menu, we do a load scene single for level 1. What happens is, firstly, it's load scene, so it's a blocking call, so everything else stops. It does all of the work to load up the new level, and then it unloads everything from any other level that is currently loaded. So load scene mode single, whatever level you give it, it will load that, and then it unloads any other levels that are currently open. Whereas load scene mode additive, what that will do is that essentially layers the scene that you specify on top, which can be really handy. For large projects, what you can do is you can split your level up into multiple different scenes. So you might have a scene that has your core geometry. You might have a scene that has all of your narrative or quest related things in it. You might have a scene that has all of your spawn markers, stuff like that in it. So that would be a case where you would use additive, where you're stacking the different scenes on top. So we can, which one we use depends on the scenario that we're working with. For now, we're just going to use single, but we will see using additive later on. So we'll set that one to single. Do the same here. Load scene, level 2. And load scene mode, single. Okay, so let's see what happens. We want to see what behavior we get with this. Now, let's run this up. Now we know exit game won't work, but let's test going to level 1. And this is a common problem that we will run into. In this case, I ran into it intentionally, but it's a really, really, really easy one to run into. So for a scene to be loadable, it has to be here in the build settings in this scenes in build section. So this must be populated. So there's a few different ways we can populate it. If we've already got a scene open, we can just go add open scenes. And then we can also drag scenes in. Now you'll notice on the right-hand side here, these scenes are being given a number. This is that index that can be used when we are doing load scene. So I can do load scene and say level 1, but I could also say load scene and just give it the number 1. I don't recommend using the index. The reason being is, okay, we've got everything set up. We know that we're loading scene index 1. and then we change the order of ones here, and what one means has a different meaning then. So it means that if you get the name wrong, you get an error, as we could see. If you get the index wrong, it could actually still find a valid scene and load it. So it means that problems are going to be harder to spot in that case, which is not something that we want. Because in this case, we get the problem occurring at the exact line where it is trying to refer to the scene. Whereas if we had the wrong indices, we would load a scene and the problem might not happen until much later and happen in a different section of code. Always better for the problems to occur as early as possible in the code. So key thing to remember, any scenes that you're wanting to be included in the build, make sure you've gone to File and Build Settings and they are added here. Whichever scene is first is the one that when your game is built, that is the scene that will be loaded before anything else. It's the default scene effectively. So if we had a splash screen for our game, then that splash screen would be the very first scene here, so that it loads up first and then can load up things like the menu and everything else. So with that hooked up, we should now be able to go to any of these levels. So let's check. So level 1, that worked, and we can see over on the left-hand side here, level 1 is loaded. And main menu won't work yet, so let's make it so that the main menu button works. So again, we need to bring in Unity Engine, Scene Management, and then we need to, again, Scene Manager, Load Scene, and Main Menu, Load Scene Mode, Single. So let's run this. And we should now be able to easily transition between all of our scenes, which is good. We want that. So we'll go level 1, cool. Main menu, level 2. And so level 2's one is not activating. So that's something where let's check what we've done for level 2 here and make sure that, yep, that is hooked up. So this is an easy thing that we can run into. And I'm going to show you because we can have two scenes loaded side by side. So there is a difference between these two scenes. Both have got a main camera, both have got a directional light, both have got an object and the UI, but level 1 has an event system and level 2 doesn't. So we need that event system in there. So an easy way if you want to transfer stuff from levels is you can, and I'll show this process again, I can just drag a level into here, and then I've got both loaded up at the same time. Then what I can do, and I use this if I want to transfer something between scenes, is I drag it over, and then I say, okay, remove this scene, but don't save changes. So easy way of transferring stuff between the scenes. Because then now I should be able to go to level 2, main menu, level 1, so I can easily flip between all of my scenes. So it makes for a really straightforward process for how we can go about doing this. And that's really powerful for us being able to have then a main menu. We could have a credits scene, a settings scene, things like of that. We can have an end game scene, so we can switch between different ones really easily. But what if we wanted to have that idea of that initial loading screen? And for that, we need to do that asynchronous loading. So let's take a look at that. Let's set up a splash screen. And what we're going to do is we're going to remember that we need to add this in. And because it's a splash screen, we want it at the very beginning. We want this to be the first thing that gets loaded. So I'm going to make this a solid background. And we're obviously going to need some text. So we want to have some text in here saying that we are loading. So this can say loading, and let's make that centered nicely. We'll fix up our screen resolution as well. And what I just want to have is I want to have this text that'll say, loading prompt. And then I want to make that be, that's about a size. Let's make that 50, and we'll make this 48. That might be a little too large. Let's go for 32. That's pretty good. And then I'm just going to chuck in a slider. Because we could use this as a way of, if we turn it off being interactable, so the slider is no longer interactable, and we could also hide the handle there. Because if we make this a bit higher, and let's bring the position of this right, we'll make this wider, make it a bit higher again, and maybe a bit wider again. Because this slider, if I bring that max, the max value can stay 0 to 1. This worked pretty nicely as a indicator for progress. Now I need to adjust this one so it can go to the far edge. So that looks pretty good. We can test and see, yep, that works all right. It's going to start off there, go to there. So that looks fairly good. And we can, that fill color there, we can change that to a bit of a nice palish green color. Looks pretty good. So we can see then a progress bar that will fill up like that. So that looks pretty solid. We turned off interactable, so that can just tick up. So that's good. All right. So now we can set up a script for this. Splash screen. So this is going to be doing the loading, but the difference is that this is going to do the loading asynchronously. So I'm going to have using Unity Engine scene management again. And the difference this time in terms of how we actually go about doing the loading is we're going to do this using this async operation that we have access to. And we're going to see how we can use that. Because what we do is we tell it to load in the background, and there's a couple of stages to the loading. And what we say is that it's allowed to do its loading up until the very, very, very last little point. And then at that last little point, that's when we hold it until it's done. And then we tell it, yep, you can actually go and finish doing the loading. So for this is something where I'm going to use something that we haven't really dived into a lot yet, called a coroutine. And we will dive more into coroutines at another point in time. This is just going to be a fairly cut down one. The idea behind a coroutine is it's a great way of being able to have something run sort of in the background. They're not really sort of fully in the background, but they are somewhat in the background. So load main menu. So what we end up doing with this is we say, hey, scene manager, load scene async. And with this, we'll just give it main menu and still give it the load scene mode, same as before, load scene mode single. But you'll notice this one returns an async operation. And that's the key part of this. That async operation allows us to monitor how that loading is going and to also be able to control that progress. So in this case, we have our scene load op. Now, the first thing we do is we say, hey, scene load op, allow scene activation. I'm going to set that to false. So what we're doing here is start an async load of the main menu, block automatic activation of the scene. Because we want to be able to control how that loading happens. So we can say, okay, well, while the scene load op is not done. So done means that it is not just loaded, but that it's also activated. So we can then work out our progress. I'm going to set up here, so we've got our serialized field for our slider. Using Unity Engine UI, slider progress bar. And what I'll be able to do is we can get our progress here. So our progress bar to value can say, hey, scene load op, what is your progress? Now, the way this progress works is a little bit odd. Fully done and ready to actually be activated is not 1. Fully done and ready to be activated is actually 0.9. So we do progress divided by 0.9f, because that rescales it. So we know this value here will only go up to 0.9f. So this gives us a value that goes from 0 to 1 then. Set progress. Need to rescale as the max progress and scene loading is 0.9. So it is a bit of an odd thing, but that is the way that works, because what we do then is finish loading. The way we check that we've finished loading is we say, okay, well, if the scene load op's progress is greater than or equal to 0.9, then we can actually say, hey, scene load op, allow scene activation is true. So we allow it to actually continue activating. And then what we have here, you wait for end of frame. So the idea behind a coroutine is it does a bit of work and then it yields. It stops until then the next time it gets set up. And there's different things that you can yield until. So you can yield for a certain amount of time. You can yield to other particular things. In this case, we're yielding until the end of this frame. So that will actually just control the loading properly. So, okay, we can see what this will do. Now, this will actually progress really, really rapidly because the new scene is going to load that quickly. So let's run this up and let's take a look. And we should see we end up in the main menu fairly quickly. So it would actually help if I hook up that code. So let's hook up the splash screen code, and we have to start our coroutine, load main menu. So we'll be able to see what will happen with this. So we run. Now, I don't have the slider linked up. So again, these are the common things that we can so easily run into. And that, regardless of how long you've been working on the stuff, you will run into it. And so we saw super quickly it runs through and gets to that point. So we can take a look, and if we start it paused, then we might be able to see a little bit more of the progress if we sort of single frame it. But even then, it goes that quickly. Because it's up and ready and loaded. Now, with a very large level, that wouldn't happen. The large level, this actually does take a chunk of time. But we might want to have it, tick up to say that 90%, and then we wait a little bit longer. That can be the case where if there's stuff you're showing on the splash screen that might be useful information, you might want to have a minimum amount of time before it actually displays it. So we could have a load time buffer, and maybe we make that 5 seconds. So then load time buffer remaining. And what we do is we populate this here, load time buffer. So the remaining buffer time, because then how we make this work is, okay, well, we're finished loading if the progress is greater than 0.9 and if our buffer time remaining is less than or equal to 0. Because then what we could do, actually, I'll restructure it slightly differently. I will say if buffer time remaining is less than 0, we do that. Otherwise, what I'm going to do before that is minus equals time.delta time, which this is actually valid to do this and will consistently give slightly different values as we'd normally expect using it in update, because this block of code does run across multiple frames. So buffer time run out, finish loading. Now, what I would do with this is I would actually let this go up to just the 0.9. Set the progress. We'll cap at 0.9 because this can only go up to 0.9. But what I can do here, so that there's a bit of movement, because the thing is, if you've got one of the big things with loading screens, have something that's showing movement on it so that it is clear that it hasn't actually crashed or stalled or gotten in an infinite loop. That's actually something that on things like consoles is a requirement, that you can't have a screen be static for more than a certain amount of time. So there needs to be something that's showing that there is progress happening there. Because what we could do is otherwise we can work out what our progress would be, because that time, that buffer time there, that is going to be our final 10%. So we could work out, okay, well, our load time buffer remaining, if we divide that by load time buffer, we're going to get a value that will start at 1 and go to 0. So if I invert that and do this, so buffer progress. So this gets me a 0 to 1 value of the buffer progress. 0 equals at start of buffer. 1 equals end of buffer. So now I've got a value that goes from 0 to 1. So I could say, well, my progress bar's value is 0.9 plus 0.1 times buffer progress. So that should mean we just get a little bit of a, it'll still keep ticking up there, which is good. So we've still got that motion and movement happening there. And we have time for, if we've got information being shown here, we can ensure that it will always be, and we can see it's ticking up, get to the end, we load the level. So it allows us, if we've got specific information we're needing to convey at that point to the user, that we can ensure that they will actually see it. So, okay, that's pretty cool. We've seen synchronous loading, we've seen asynchronous loading, and we've specifically seen it in the context of a single scene. But this idea of having multiple scenes. So one of the things that where this can come in super handy is if you want to have a what's often called a bootstrap scene. So a scene that its job is to hold information, it persists around, it can be a way of passing information between scenes. So we're going to have a look at how we can set up something like of that. So I'm going to create a scene, so bootstrap scene. And again, I need to make sure this is in my build settings, but I don't want it to be the first one because that's the main one that'll get loaded, our splash screen. So my bootstrap scene. So first thing I want to do in my bootstrap scene is I actually want to delete everything in it because this is an additional layer that sits on top. So we want to have only the essential things we need in it. In particular, we don't want to have things like camera and lights in it because the bootstrap scene shouldn't be affecting the visuals of the other scenes. But we're going to set up some scripts. One is going to be the bootstrapper. So it's going to be responsible for ensuring the bootstrap scene is loaded. And then we're going to have a script that is going to be the bootstrapped data. Because the only thing that is going to exist in this is the bootstrap data. That's the only thing that will be available. So bootstrap data. So we want to have that in here. So this scene just has the bootstrap data, nothing else. So the behavior we want is that when we load into our scene, that if the bootstrap scene is not already loaded, that we forcibly load it. So let's take a look at how we can go about doing that. And one of the things we will need to know is we need to make sure we've got the name of the bootstrap scene, which we do. So the process for setting up this idea of this bootstrap thing, we have our bootstrapper here, and this is about to end up looking a little bit weird. It's not going to be based on mono behavior. It's not going to have a starter and update. And it's going to be static. We're still going to need our scene management side of things. But what we're going to be doing, and I'm going to have a bootstrap scene name, which is bootstrap scene. So I'm going to set up a function here that is perform bootstrap. Oops, needs to be public static void. This function here, so it's not based on, this thing isn't based on mono behavior, so I can't attach it to anything, but I still need this code to run. And so I can actually do this. There's this runtime initialize on load method, which this will run whenever the game is loaded. So runtime, oops, let's try it again, runtime. You can see these different points where we can say where it is going to run. So we can load things super early, so before stuff like splash screen, and that's meaning the Unity splash screen. So there's different points where we can load it. In this case, we're going to load it before scene load. Because what we can do is we can loop through all of our scenes and we can check if the bootstrap scene is one of the ones that's loaded. And that's how we use this. We check if the bootstrap scene is loaded. If it's not, then we load it. So scene index is less than scene manager. You can say, hey, how many scenes have you got? And this scene count refers to the number of loaded ones, not the number of ones configured in the build settings. So plus scene index. So then we can check, okay, well, scene manager, get scene at. So we give it a scene index, and then we can check the name. So if that is equal to bootstrap scene name, then we're done. So we're checking if bootstrap scene is already loaded. If it's not, so the only way we can get to this line of code here is if that bootstrap scene is not loaded. Bootstrap scene. So we do scene manager, load scene, bootstrap scene name, and then this time we go load scene mode additive. Because the idea behind the bootstrap scene is it's something that sits on top of the other scenes there. We don't want it to replace any of the ones. So this should mean, when we run this, we'll see our bootstrap scene appear here. But there is likely to be a problem that we will run into, but let's find out. So we play, runs, we can see it has loaded the bootstrap scene, which is cool. Gets to the end, but then it gets to the next scene and our bootstrap scene has gone because we haven't done anything to tell it that we want the bootstrap data to stick around. We have to actually tell it, no, this data, we need you to keep it around. So we can actually do this, and it's really straightforward. All we do, and I would normally do this in await, we just say don't destroy on load. This, when we use this and we give it ourselves, this will prevent this object from being unloaded. So it's a way of saying, if a scene has a don't destroy unload object, then that scene is not going to get cleaned up, and in particular this object will not get cleaned up. What that allows us to do is this bootstrap data, I can now confidently access this from anywhere in my code. And we'll see, I run this up and it will be present, and it will be present there from as soon as the game is up and running. So we've got our bootstrap scene, and we'll see our bootstrap data is down here now. We go to level 1, bootstrap data, and just to make sure that, yep, it is really this same one, I've moved its location. It doesn't matter where I go, that same object is still there. Which what that would allow us to do is, you get to the end of the game and you want to track scores. You want to have setting information that's carrying over between different areas. You can use that bootstrap scene to be able to stash that information. So really, really easy, because we can, with how we have designed this, and so this is the idea behind we design sort of rules into our code. So we have set this bootstrap scene, we are guaranteeing it is going to be loaded. This logic will ensure that it is loaded, and the bootstrap data itself is ensuring that it cannot be destroyed, which means we can then confidently, in any of the rest of the code in our project, access that bootstrapped data, because we know it will be available. So we could find object of type it because we know it will be there, and we know we'll have that single copy of it. So really, really handy for having systems there that you want to be able to easily access and stash data between different levels. Like I said, if you wanted to stash the results of what's happened in a level, so then on the next screen you could put up different information, or so that stuff carries over from one level to another. This is a way that you can do that very easily. So just to recap, scenes are a way of us grouping stuff for our levels, and we can choose different ways of how we can load those scenes. If we just use normal load that doesn't say async, then it is a blocking load, which means everything stops until that load is completed. We also can use an async load if we're wanting it to load in the background. When we're using the async load, we have to keep track of the progress. When the progress hits 0.9, that actually means it's done. And if we want to then control when it actually activates, we can use this allow scene activation to be able to control when that happens. So we can do things, for example, of ensuring that there's a little bit of a delay, things like that. We could kick off fades, anything like that at that point in time. When we're loading stuff, we have this idea of being able to load things in single mode, which loads the new scene and unloads everything else. Or we can load them in additive mode, where what it will do is it will layer it on top. And we saw this idea of setting up a bootstrapper. So being able to have a scene that we use some code to force that scene to always be loaded before anything else does, and use some code to ensure that that scene doesn't get unloaded. So we have something that's always around that we can always refer to if we're wanting to pass data between our different scenes. And most importantly, we saw that the build settings, we need to have any scenes that we're loading listed here, and that the very first scene that's listed is the one that it is going to load first. It's the default scene. So experiment with this. Experiment with storing some information in that bootstrapper and retrieving it. Experiment with different things that you could be doing with the loading setup here. Set up a larger, more complicated level. See how long you can make that take. Look at different effects that you could be having happen in there. Key thing there, diving in and experimenting with the different areas, as always, is the key essential thing to be doing there. Thanks, folks. If you're looking for the code for the project, then in the description below, you'll find a link to the GitHub. And on the GitHub, I've got the code for this project and for all of the other projects. They're freely available. And if you have found the video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, then throwing in a like or subscribing is always a huge help. If you're looking for further ways to support, then I do have a Patreon set up, and that's going to help me keep managing to do these videos for a long time to come, which is going to help more people make cool things. And that's awesome, because that's what this is all about, is helping more people make more cool things. And that is all. Thank you.